of the roof of the cab of 100. Up at the roof sheathing, there have been various things that have happened to the roof over the years. In the case of the one we're looking at right now, where there are 4 boards, this is where the stovepipe went through, and for whatever reason, somewhere in its life here at Seashore, the stovepipe was removed, and it was just some rough boards were put in there. They weren't thick enough to match the other boards, which are 7/8 inch thick, which is not a standard thickness anymore. So we made up some new ones out of poplar and nailed them in, as you can see. When we do put the stove in, we'll cut a round hole in all of those, and they will, then the pipe can go through. Over on the other side, the long ones were the same way. They were some rough boards that were too thin. So we ended up making new ones. And that one of those over on the other side, the boards were rotted and we couldn't get them smoothed down. Now, it's interesting, the boards were originally all tongue and groove. Now, we couldn't put them all, in order to get them back inside, we couldn't put them tongue and groove, all of them. Some of them were. And also, the V-grooves, in some cases, denote separate boards, and in the other cases, there are 2 board widths, but are actually one board with a V-groove going down the center of the board. So we tried to line them up so that everything lines up with the way they were originally. There are different widths of wood. There's narrow wood, there's wide wood, and then there's middle-sized wood there. But Locomotive was making the best advantage of the wood that they had. All the light bulbs we took out the other day and put them into storage so we don't bang them when we're working up there on the ceiling. We're on the number 1 end of the car looking at the pilot, and it's not obvious from any of the photographs, but we did find that there were 2 braces, which we can see if you look underneath, that supplemented the wood to keep the pilot straight. When this car was worked on in its earlier years, the whole end was taken off, and these strips of iron were there, but they were all bent up. They must have caught on the track or something and curled themselves up. So this went right around like that. So these had to be straightened out flat. And this piece was all right, the one that went across. And then we bolted it all together and gave it lots of heavy coats of ball grip so that it should be well protected, because it's not something you can get at easily. So essentially this pilot with some very small details accepting is done. Now let's go look at the number 2 end. This is the number 2 end, and as you can see, Jim Mackle is in the process of putting the teeth on. The frame is bolted on both ends to the fixed pilot braces, I guess we're calling, or yeah, pilot braces. Here's the frame underneath. Again, this one was all bent up. This one was still on the car when we started working on it, and we had to take them all apart, straighten them out pretty well, underneath there was no cross piece, and we don't know whether there was one there or not. There were holes as if there was, but it had disappeared somewhere along the line, so we had to fabricate a new one. Now there are holes in that. No, not where they should be. We're going to have to put a bolt here and one on the other end so that this all becomes a unit. Something else that has been added recently is the knuckle coupler has been put on, and this is all ready to hook on to something else. The one on the other end, we had trouble with the pin not fitting, and we don't know why it doesn't, but we're going to have to do a little grinding on it. To lift this, there are various rods and so forth which have got to be bolted on, but that's a later sort of thing. Now, if you look underneath, you can just, actually we'll have to do it from the other direction. Now, something else that's interesting, and it may not show here, let's try it. Yes, look at the side bearing. Now, there's grease in there between the truck side bearing and the body side bearing, and very easily I am rocking this back and forth. That means the car is essentially balanced, and everything came out right in all our figuring. When we put the truck down, we were concerned whether the side bearing would be right down hard to the point that the car would turn, there'd be difficulty with the car turning. Well, it turned out that the car is balanced beautifully, and that rocking I could do with, I'm only pushing with about 5 pounds of pressure here. It's exactly balanced. So is it luck or was it skill? We don't know. Also, I'm thinking of all kinds of things. This spring that you see is called a brake release spring, and when the air brakes go on, it pulls against this lever here, and the brake shoes will pull against the wheels. And by the way, we didn't put all the brake shoes in because it was extremely difficult to do in this position. So we will do that when it's on the pit and we can get underneath. Anyway, when they're pulled on, there's tension put in this spring, and then when the brakes are released, that will pull them back off the wheels. We had a problem finding the proper springs. This is one of the originals. It was a little bit distorted, but there's plenty of tension in it, and it will work fine. So we had to take that all apart and sandblast it and so forth. And there are 4 of them. There's one here, one on the other side, and then the same thing on the other end of the truck. You can see the motors inside. They were put in before, obviously before the trucks were put under the car. It was done rather quickly because we were concerned about snowstorms, which did come out back and would have made the shifting of the trucks under the car very difficult. But we made it just in time to avert. In fact, the motors came in covered with snow on one truck, and they're now in here. We were not able to put all of the bolts in that hold the axle cap, the motors, and that hold the gear cases, because it was just impossible to get underneath there with the proper wrenches. Now, that will mean that the car will not be able to be run, but it can be pulled around in the spring when it gets taken over to the pit, and then all those will be tightened up properly. Before the motors were actually put in to the car, all the bearings were packed with wool waste, and they are lubricated anyway. Called Sherman set screw connectors, and the reason that one has no insulation on it is it's a ground wire. It goes right to the motor frame, and so there's its potential difference between it and anything else doesn't exist, so we didn't need to insulate it. This one has got to be hung up slightly differently because it's going to get wrapped up in things. I just noticed that this whole arrangement here needs a little extra mounting. On each side of the truck is a long steel bar. It's about a 1/2 inch by 2 inches that starts up here in this corner, goes down under the journal box, goes the whole length of the truck, and comes back up on the other end. It's called a binder bar, and what it does is, if this truck should have to be lifted, it will keep the journal boxes from falling out and keep the truck together. It was a very difficult job to get that in place. We had to line up all the bolts here, and because they had been bent over the years, they didn't quite fit, and there's also some slight differences. But we managed to get it all bolted into place, and that is the two on this side. The other two are only fastened at the ends, and we're going to have to drill up underneath because things just don't line up when the car is on the pit. This is outside the rail enough so we'll be able to get a long drill in here and bore up through from the underside and make them fit. Something else that happened recently is we put the last covers, springs that mount the journal box covers on to keep them from, that keeps the journal boxes tight. We were missing some of these springs, but we found some in parts. This is actually part of an LRV, which is a very modern car, probably 80 years newer than this car. But anyway, it's exactly what was there before. We had to make this, there were a couple of these missing also, so we made those. And that holds the journal box on tightly. Now, one of the big jobs which we accomplished was to get the car, started getting the major parts together, and that was installing the motors. I guess I don't have to fasten that on because we're going to sandblast it anyway. All four motors are now under the car, and if you look right there, you'll see the wires with the green tags. Those are the motor wires. They come down from the body, and up near the wood, our actual connectors. There are four screw connectors in with brass tubes with set screws in the side, and then the motors, the lower wires, are what actually go to the motor. Now this car is somewhat easier to run the wires because the motors are mounted what they call inside hung. That is, they are between the wheels and the center or the bolster of the truck. That means when the truck turns, it's only going to move a relatively short distance, maybe a foot in either direction, so we don't have to allow a lot of extra wire. On some cars, the wires come in from the outside, and that means the motor will swing a long distance, and the wires can get hung up on things, and it's very difficult to figure out just how long they are. Now, the connections we made are only temporary just to see how they go, and then we may end up cutting the motor leads back because they're really probably longer than they need to be, and then we somehow have to bundle them up. We did put some leather straps. It's a little hard to see them. We're preparing the roof of the cab for canvas, and way back in the Atlantic Shoreline days, or the Laconia Car Company days I should say, they used planes to do this, and you can see here the remnants of the plane marks, where these are just a little bit hollowed out when they did it by hand. We're using a belt sander with a coarse belt to go over them. What we did first was we stripped all the canvas off, and then you see the lighter colored wood here, and a couple other places are where there were boards that were defective, or in this case boards that were a little too thin, and I added an extra layer on top of it. Then we took West System epoxy, and I mixed it with the sanding dust that came off of the roof, so we don't waste any money or anything, and filled in everything, all of the holes and the areas that were depressions and nail holes and so forth. It's not going to be perfect. We could keep going over it and over it and over it. It's swelled up in places, but it will be smooth, and the idea is to get it so the board lines don't show in the final canvas. The next step will be to paint this with a stain, the canvas stain, the same stain we've been using under the car, and then we'll put the tarpaulin over it and paint it again, trolley boards, and then we'll be done. Okay? You could take a picture of me doing this with my still camera, couldn't you? Or
I could, yeah. Yeah.
It's a little hard to pull it tight because the roof has a sag in it, but it seems to, wherever I put that stuff on, I think it's shrinking up quite